Rent bumps ensure your revenue keeps pace with inflation, okay? Pre-negotiated rent increases over the term of the lease, so that's essentially what they are, but you could have fixed rent bumps, so a set percentage. So for example, fixed rent bumps could be 3%, and this is all the norm, okay? If people don't negotiate these rent bumps, it means that they're not like a sophisticated landlord, let's say. He doesn't understand that that is the norm. So it's not gonna scare the tenant that you're increasing the rent every year. It's just what it is, okay? So a lot of times you'll see people just decide that they'll increase the rent by, let's say, a fixed amount, so 3%, 2%, something like that, okay? Other times you'll see it's adjusted by CPI, so the Consumer Price Index, which is literally inflation. The reason why that one is a little bit less common is because if inflation, like we've seen in the last like 5 years, let's say, if all of a sudden inflation increases by 7% or 10% that year, it's unlikely to happen, but if it does happen, then their rent would go up by that amount. They'd rather know like there's a maximum, like basically they want to forecast their company expenses as much as possible. So if you just put it on CPI, it's hard for them to forecast how much rent they're going to be paying because they don't know exactly where CPI will come out to. But if you tell them a fixed amount of 2-3%, even if in the end they end up paying more than they would have if they chose to be based on CPI, it's controllable. Like there's no downside risk. They know exactly what the rent will be in year 1, in year 2, in year 3, in year 4, in year 5 ahead of time. See the difference? Okay. So usually we just go with fixed. It's also easy for us to estimate our rent every single year, right? Because we know exactly how much it's going to be. Now we're going to go on to options, okay? So there's many different types of options that you can include in an offer to purchase or in a lease. In this case, we're talking about leases, okay? So you could have the option to renew. So you could have an option to renew, meaning I have a 5-year lease. At the end of my 5 years, I have an option to renew for an additional 5 years, or for an additional 2 years, or for an additional 3 years, whatever. It could be any amount, okay? So you have X amount of options for X amount of years, okay? So essentially with options, you could have, it could be customizable any way you want. You could have 3 options, 2 of them are 2 years, 1 of them is 5 years, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is, you can negotiate that with the tenant, but a lot of times they'll want an option because they want the flexibility to be able to stay in that space if they want to, but they also don't want to commit to it ahead of time in the event that they need more space or they need less space or whatever. So that's why options come in handy, okay? Now, you'll see 2 types of options, okay? You'll see a fixed option, so it means like after 5 years, I have an option to renew at $5, at $10 net, at $20 net, whatever, it's fixed ahead of time. Or it's fair market value. So there's whatever the market net rent per foot is at that time is what the tenant will pay if he wants to renew his lease. If there's a dispute, the lease outlines what happens in the event of a dispute. You get an appraiser. If we don't agree on what the appraiser says, we get another appraiser, whatever. There's this whole mechanism of finding out what the market rent is, but essentially it's market rent. If it's market rent, there's risk on both sides. Oftentimes the rent just goes up. So there's not much risk for the owner because he's just gonna end up charging more rent, most likely. But there still is a risk that the market rent ends up going down and then the option is at a lower amount than he was previously paying the tenant. And then, but most of the risk is on the tenant side here with the fair market value option because when rent increases, it could double like we've seen in industrial. So some people had options at fair market value and then their lease went from $5 net increased by 3%, let's say. In the end, I don't know what it comes out to, but probably $6, $6.50 maybe. And then all of a sudden, market rent is $12.50, $15. So it's like 3 times, almost 3 times more rent that they're paying just in base rent. That's not even including the increased cost of additional rent because the cost of everything just goes up over time as well, right? So that's why a lot of tenants, they try to negotiate fixed amount like upfront for the option, okay? But then for a landlord, for an owner, if you agree to a fixed amount, that's where all the risk comes really for an owner. Most of the risk is because if I agree to a fixed amount today and then rent doubles, like the market rent doubles or triples or quadruples, it's so hard for me to sell that asset now because it's so undervalued because the rent is 1/4 or 1/3 or half of what the actual market rent should be for that asset. So now my NOI is substantially less than the market NOI should be. If my NOI is less, then the value of my property is less, right? Like we've been discussing in all these lessons, okay? So those are the risks. Now, if I go into the other options, okay, you have an option to purchase. You could negotiate an option to purchase in the lease. This is not great because then it kind of makes it harder to sell your property afterwards, because anybody who submits an offer knows that the tenant could just veto it. You try to not give tenants an option to purchase if you can. Then you have right of first refusal on leases or purchases. So they could have a right of first refusal. So if you get an offer, it's the same thing kind of as an option to purchase, I guess. Whereas with the right of first refusal, it's only when, the key difference is right of first refusal means you have to receive an offer to lease, or you have to receive an offer to purchase. And once you receive it, you send it to me. I decide if I want to take it, abide by those terms and take on the lease or take on the purchase, okay? Whereas if it's just an option to purchase, then they could exercise that option to purchase the property at whatever conditions you had agreed to before, even if you don't receive any offers on the property. Make sense? There's other options, but these are the main options. So now 4, finding the right tenants, okay? So now you know how to charge rent, you know how leases work, you know how all this stuff works, you know how to negotiate your lease and all that. Now you have to find the tenant to actually occupy the space, okay? So my suggestion to market your property is really to just hire a commercial leasing broker, okay? Like, you're not gonna know the market rent as well as them. You're not gonna have the same reach as they do with the tenants. You're not gonna, you know, you're also, if you deal directly with the tenant, you don't have that barrier where it's like, when you have a commercial broker representing you, he is like the gap between the person that, like the tenant and the landlord. It just creates that barrier, and it's easier to negotiate deals than if you're direct with the decision maker, let's say. So it's a lot easier, hire a commercial broker. And if you have a good commercial broker, he'll already have tenants for that space, or he'll know like relatively, like he'll know on the top of his head how long it should take to lease that space. So hire a commercial leasing broker, and then just factor in the commission for that leasing broker into your pro forma, into your analysis, okay? So typical leasing commissions in Montreal, 5% of the net rent for years 1 to 3, then 2.5% of net rent for the years thereafter. And if it's co-brokered, the above rates are increased by 50%. Also, obviously you can negotiate whatever you want for leases. This is a standard thing. If you have a really good broker, he's probably not going to budge much on what standard commissions are for leases. But anyways, factor those costs in. Now we're going to move on, understanding the tenant's needs, okay? So whether they need high ceilings, whether they need truck level docks, drive-in docks, if they need, basically this comes into play first when you're looking at what building to buy. You want to buy the building that has as many characteristics that are favorable to the tenants that you're looking for, okay? So you don't want to buy, if you know that 90% of your tenants potential tenants need ceiling heights above 18 feet clear, you don't want to go buy a building for 16 feet clear, because now you could only ever lease it to the 10% of people that want that type of ceiling height. That's not actually the case, okay? A lot of people still are okay with 16 feet clear, but just substantially less. But everything, like when you look at a building, you want to do that analysis and kind of see like how many like of all these industrial characteristics, I need to make sure that most of them are good enough or as good as possible, so that I have the most amount of tenants that would be interested in my space when it comes to me leasing it. See what I'm trying to say? So this happens beforehand, but then once you've acquired a building that has these good characteristics for warehousing and distribution, for example, now you're going to market those things. So if you bought the building because it had a lot of truck level loading docks, because all the trucks could maneuver freely, because it had a small office component, because you know, it was like the layout in the warehouse was very easy for distribution tenants, okay? That's what you're gonna use in your marketing. You're gonna specify all these things because now you're casting such a huge net. So many tenants will be interested in leasing the space because the characteristics work for such a large amount of the tenants that are looking for space. Make sense? Lastly, screen your tenants. That's just vetting the tenants, making sure they don't go bankrupt, checking their financials, all stuff like that. But a good commercial broker will do all these things for you. So just hire a good commercial leasing broker. So now we've come to the end of the lesson. Just to go over what we've covered, lease types. So choosing the right lease, net versus gross, how you charge your rent, base rent plus operating expenses equals gross rent. Then we talked about the rent bumps, built-in rent increases to keep pace with inflation. We talked about options, the different types of options. We talked about finding tenants, just hire a commercial leasing broker and incorporate the cost of his commissions in your pro forma, make sure the numbers work ahead of time. So now that you've stabilized your property, we're gonna dive into exiting, okay? So you stabilize the property. Now on the next lesson, we're gonna go into exiting by either, well, actually, I won't tell you how we'll exit. I'll tell you that on the next lesson. But essentially what we're gonna cover is the two major exit strategies. We're gonna cover how to calculate the value of your asset when it's stabilized and ready to exit. And we're gonna talk about how to determine which exit strategy is best for you.
So I wanted to know, because you said there was like net and then like double net and triple net. So double and normal net, what would be the difference between those and like modified gross?
So that's why I don't like these definitions, because like they change depending on who is giving the definitions.
Yeah.
I mean, there's probably like the official definition, right? But like there's also different things that happen within different markets. So like within a market, they might consider, you know, modified gross something, and then they might consider double net something and single net and whatever. So I just like understanding in general is like, if it's modified gross, then it's not fully gross. There are certain things that you're gonna be responsible for paying in terms of operating expenses. So it could be utilities. Maybe modified gross would be you pay utilities and taxes, okay? So like, but instead of giving it a definition, I just like to understand what it means. Modified gross means different. It's modified. It's a modified version of what a traditional gross lease would be. A traditional gross lease is one amount of rent, doesn't change at all other than the rent bumps in the lease or whatever. But other than that, it won't change based on changes in operating expenses or anything like that. If it's modified gross, it will change based on whatever operating expenses you are saying ahead of time are the responsibility of that tenant. That makes sense?
Yeah.
And then if you look at, like you said, single net and stuff like that, again, same thing with net. Instead of calling it triple net, double net, this and that, it just says, I just like to say like, what operating expenses and CapEx is the responsibility of the tenant? Mm-hmm. This is like, so then that's the way to know that you never fuck it up. So one guy goes, oh, it's double net. And then the whole time you think it's a specific amount of things that are included and a specific amount of operating expenses that aren't. And then in the end, you found out he meant something completely different than you had in your mind. What's the point? If he says, I want double net, okay, what does that mean? What operating expenses are you saying you want to be responsible for, and what ones are you not going to be? Okay, mm-hmm. That's how I look at it. So it makes it a lot easier to understand all these different, you know, definitions of modified gross, net, whatever. See what I mean?
Yeah. So if I understand, basically, if it's not triple net or it's not gross, you just ask what's being covered.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Even if it's triple net, though, one last thing is like, sometimes people say triple net, and then they're like, okay, but I'm not paying for the for repairs of the roof. It's like, okay, well, even that's why I don't even talk about triple net. I just say like it's a net lease, and then I say everything's included. And then if we have to break it down, I'll break it all down. But you know, that's why even triple net is like, could be misinterpreted, but for most part, triple net means like everything. So anyways.
So if you say with the tenants triple net, like let's say for the roof example, you don't need to mention it in the lease, right? The roof, for example, like you could just, when it happens, you could just increase their expenses, and then if they ask, you say, oh,
no, it doesn't work like that.
No, so
that's what I'm saying. You have to, all those things have to be agreed to in the lease. It doesn't mean that, like basically in the lease, what it'll say is the tenant is also responsible for capital expenditures, and then it'll explain how they're responsible for it. So it'll say, if in the scenario that I was saying, it'll say they're responsible for the cost of it amortized over its useful life, and they'll be responsible for their portion of the property over however many years they're in the property over its useful life. Like it'll be detailed like that. And then if it happens, then you show them the invoice. And if they forget that they had agreed to pay the CapEx, then you show them the lease, exactly what it says in the lease. But it's not, you don't just not discuss it in the lease and then surprise them. That's the point. The lease is everything. Like, even if you say it's triple net, you don't just write in the lease, it's triple net. Like you have to actually detail exactly what expenses that tenant is responsible for paying and the increases to those expenses as well. Like you have to detail it in the lease, okay? That's why these definitions are like oversimplifications, because at the end of the day, when you go back to the lease has to detail these things. It doesn't just use the definition, you know, it actually goes into detail.
It doesn't matter, like your definitions, because it's all written down. Like, no matter what the definition is, you're not gonna, like you said, you're not gonna write double net in the lease, you're gonna write what is a double net, then you're gonna write
Exactly,
fully
but
customizable, it's whatever you want. Right?
exactly. The only thing is, it's good to know the definitions in general, or that they at least exist,
Yeah.
just because when you're talking with a potential tenant or a landlord or whatever, or you're talking with a seller of a property, if he uses those definitions, you want to have a general idea of what he means. But when he tells me that stuff, when he uses one of those definitions, I specify. So what do you mean by double net? Like what expenses aren't included? Then he'll say, oh, maintenance. Okay, great. Then I won't say it's a double net lease excluding maintenance. I'll just say the tenant's responsible for all operating expenses except for maintenance. See? But that's why it's important to at least understand, like when he says double net, I know there's one or a few operating expenses that aren't the tenant's responsibility. I need to know which ones those are. If it's single net, there's a lot of operating expenses, I guess, that the tenant is not responsible for. What are those? If it's triple net, I'll just confirm, is it all the operating expenses that the tenant's responsible for? See what I mean? So it gives me like a starting point it gives me an idea of what he's saying. I just need to confirm. Based on the definition he uses, I have different questions for him to confirm. Make sense?
So in the lesson, we covered how like net lease is the standard for leases and stuff. And sorry, it's more favorable generally because like they're covering the increases in the expenses, right? Is there ever a situation where it's more favorable for a landlord to choose a gross lease? If you understand my question.
I mean, theoretically, if the gross lease was negotiated to take into consideration substantial increases in operating expenses, and then those operating expenses don't come up, then your NOI would be higher than you had thought it would be with a gross lease. Whereas that can't happen for industrial. Like I can't overcharge for operating expenses. Like if they increase, I'll increase it. If they don't increase, I'll charge the same. So it's like you don't get upside if your expenses are like less, let's say, and usually like what I was saying is like you charge like a fixed amount of operating expenses. Sometimes your operating expenses come below that, but it's like very small amount below that. That's not even like considerable. So I guess that would be the only case where a gross lease would end up outperforming a net lease. But for me personally, like it's not about outperforming one or the other. It's about risk management. Like as an owner with a net lease, you don't have the risk of your operating expenses increasing so much and ruining the NOI of that building. So I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody signed a gross lease for $10, a gross lease for $10. That could end up being horrible because at the time your operating expenses might have been $2, so he was paying $8 net, right? So your NOI is $8 a foot net times the square footage of the property. Now, operating expenses for that same property are $6. So now 10 minus 6, his NOI is $4. So his NOI went in half because operating expenses increased and he had a gross lease. See? So that's where the huge risk is. Whereas if he even signed a net lease at $5 a foot net, it's not going to change over the whole term. So at the end, he's still getting $5 a foot net. See what I mean? So it's like, that's where net leases are just 1,000 times better than a gross lease, is because you need to be protected in that event, because if your NOI gets diminished to that extent, like that's literally how you could go bankrupt. Like you can't support your debt anymore all of a sudden because your operating expenses went up so much, but you had signed this lease 10 years ago thinking they wouldn't have increased that much, and now you're fucked. See the thing? So that's why like net leases are just, like it's not about maximizing the money you make from the lease. It's all about your risk management, right? There's significant less risk for the owner.
So it's just easier to mitigate the risk with the net leases.
Exactly. And then yes, that risk is now on the tenant, but that's why you won't traditionally see the tenant signing like forever leases, because like they also want to mitigate their risk, in the event that expenses go up so substantially that it makes no sense for them to operate at the property anymore. Or if they're super sophisticated tenants, they might say like, if operating expenses go up to this amount, I have an out in my lease. And a sophisticated owner could also negotiate, if the I'm giving you a gross lease of $10, but if operating expenses ever go up to $6 and I could prove it, then I also have an out in the lease. Like, leases are fully customizable, but essentially the main point to answer your question is that net leases are the way to go all the time for an owner because your downside risk is substantially less, you know? Make sense?
Yeah.
For example, in residential real estate, when you have a mortgage, you can choose fixed or variable. Before, you're talking about CPI versus fixed. It's the same concept.
No, not at all. So interest rates are completely separate from inflation, okay? So inflation is essentially, to be very simple, is like inflation is the government goes and they say, okay, we're gonna take a basket of goods, let's say of apples, bananas, gas, eggs, whatever, like 5 to 10 goods in general, and they're gonna say, we're gonna track the price of those goods over time. And then that gives us, what they say is that gives us a general idea of how much price is changing year to year. So if that basket of goods, all those things cost $10, and then the next year they cost on average $20, so they all doubled in value, let's say they doubled in cost, then inflation would be 100%, right? Like, even though not every single thing in the economy doubled in cost, they're just saying that is a reflection of, in general, how much prices have gone up within the economy. Why it's a bit of a scam is because the government is now changing the basket of goods. So like, it literally makes no sense at this point because they could just randomly change the basket of goods. Okay, but it still gives you a good idea. But for example, if they remove energy and then your energy cost doubles, but that's not factored into inflation, how, whatever they're telling you inflation is, doesn't make sense because as a consumer, I'm always paying for energy. You're taking out energy of the equation, but the cost of energy doubled, and you're telling me my inflation's 2%, but I'm paying, but energy is 25% of my expenses monthly, and that's doubled. So how the hell are you telling me inflation's 2%? See how it's a weird calculation? Anyways, just a little economics 101 there. So essentially, that's how inflation works. So inflation is just trying to track the change in the cost of goods over time, okay? So now we put that aside. Interest rate, fixed or variable, okay, is based on the bonds, like I was saying, okay? It's based on, it's basically the cost of money, okay? And if it's fixed, it means that today, so even forget about the bonds. Interest rates, fixed or variable, is just the cost of money. It's the cost to borrow money, right? So it's the cost of money, okay? So if I agree today to a fixed interest rate, that means that money is costing me this percentage over this fixed amount of time. Simple like that. If I agree to variable, it means I agree to pay this much interest today, but every single month or every single 6 months or whatever, if the interest rate, which is determined by the bonds, goes up or down, the interest rate I pay on my variable loan will go up or down. See what I mean? So that's the difference. So it's different. So interest rate, fixed or variable, I just explained now, that's completely separate than the CPI. CPI is the cost of goods over time. Two separate things. Make sense?
Yeah. And would you say for CPI versus fixed, for the tenant and landlord, fixed is more ideal because they can predict it as opposed to not knowing?
Yeah, so whenever you could reduce the downside risk and make things more predictable, like that's always, in my opinion, the way to go because it's just less risky. If you could predict things with high accuracy, then there's way less risk. If you, like, essentially, if your rent bumps are at CPI, it's the equivalent of the downside risk of having like a gross lease, let's say. It's like you don't know, like if all of a sudden operating expenses go up like crazy, I'm responsible for it and I'm screwed. Same way with CPI, if all of a sudden inflation is such a high number, I have to pay that high number and I'm screwed. See what I mean? So why, as a tenant, would you agree to that? And also as a landlord, if I'm predicting, you know, CPI is 3%, 3%, 3%, and then all of a sudden it's -2, like now my rent increases. So even for me, it's less predictable. So it's just for both parties to have predictability and certainty. It's just easier to agree on a fixed rent bump ahead of time and then not have to worry about the rent fluctuating based on a number that you don't know what it's going to be. See what I mean? Subscribe, click the bell icon to be notified when we release the next episode. I hope you enjoyed. Leave a comment down below if you did. Thank you very much.